boys and girls, how many of you like to play with Legos? Yeah, they're a lot of fun, aren't they? Use your imagination and to build all kinds of really cool creations. Well, in today's Bible lesson, we're going to hear about a time when God's people wanted to rebuild their temple. And if you remember, a temple is where God met his people in the Old Testament. And see, when God's people were sent to live somewhere else for a while, their temple was destroyed. But now they're allowed to come back and start rebuilding it. So we're going to learn about what happened with rebuilding the temple from the books of Ezra and Haggai. So we're actually going to watch 2 different lesson videos today to see what happened in that building process. Let's watch.
Hey everybody, I'm Megan and this is Jessie. Hi! Jessie, how was your camping trip? Did you have fun?
It was good, but I'm so glad to be home.
Really? How come?
I get to sleep in a bed in my warm room.
Oh, did it get cold out there?
Yes. All I had to sleep in was a sleeping bag that wasn't very warm, and I was so cold, and the ground under me was so hard.
That doesn't sound super fun.
Yeah, my dad said that we will get me a warmer sleeping bag next time.
That's a good idea. In today's Bible story, God's people got to go home. They had been living in Babylon like prisoners, but God promised to bring his people home, and he did. Listen to the story. God's people were in Babylon, far away from their homes and land. But God had made a promise. God had said that the people would have to stay in Babylon for 70 years, but then he would bring his people back home. God always keeps his promises. After 70 years, God gave King Cyrus an idea. Cyrus said, "Let God's people go back to their land. Let them rebuild God's temple in Jerusalem." This was good news. Before, God's people had to stay in Babylon like prisoners. Now, they were free. They could finally go home. So the people got ready to go. King Cyrus and the other people living in Babylon gave them gifts like gold, silver, and animals. A man named Zerubbabel led God's people back home. Some of the people had never seen Jerusalem because they had been born in Babylon. When they got to Judah, each family set up its house. Then the people met together in Jerusalem to start rebuilding God's temple. God had special laws for how to build the temple, and God's people were careful to obey them. The priests made an altar in the same place the old altar had been. Then they made offerings and sacrifices to God. The people started building. First, they needed money to buy supplies. God's people gave money to the men in charge of building the temple. They paid people to bring big logs to Jerusalem. The workers made the foundation, or the bottom, of the temple. The foundation was very important. A strong foundation makes a building strong. The people were so happy that the foundation was done. The priests put on special clothes. The people shouted and sang songs to God. God is good. He is loving and always will be, they said. What a happy day for God's people. Not everyone was happy, though. Some of the older people remembered what the first temple had looked like long ago, before it had been knocked down. The people were sad, and they cried loudly. The sounds of people shouting and crying was so loud that it could be heard far away. Zerubbabel led God's people home to fix the temple. Jesus came to earth to save God's people. One day, Jesus will come back. He will fix up a greater home for all of God's people, and we will live with Him forever. God's people were happy to be home. They had lived in Babylon for a very long time. But the king had let them go home. They walked all the way home to Jerusalem to rebuild God's temple. The people had started to work on the temple, but their neighbors said, "Stop building the temple." So God's people stopped. Building the temple was hard. Maybe God doesn't want us to build it, they thought. But God did want His people to finish the temple. God sent 2 prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, to talk to the people. Haggai and Zechariah said, "Keep building. God is with you." So God's people started to work on the temple again. The king of Persia ruled over the land where God's people lived. The king's name was Darius. Darius put a helper in charge of the land where God's people lived. The king's helper saw God's people working.
What?
He asked their leader, Zerubbabel, "Do you have permission to rebuild this temple?" "Yes," said Zerubbabel. The helper sent a letter to King Darius to find out if Zerubbabel was telling the truth. The helper's letter to the king said this: "Dear King Darius, the people here are working hard to build the temple to their God. They said King Cyrus said they could build. Please find out if this is true." King Cyrus had been king before Darius. When a king made an important decision, someone wrote it down on a scroll. So Darius looked for the old scroll. His servants found it. The scroll said, "Let God's people rebuild the temple." God's people had told the truth. King Cyrus had also said, "Help God's people pay for the temple. Give them money from the royal bank to buy supplies." So King Darius wrote a letter to his helper. He said, "Stay away from the workers at the temple. Do not bother them or try to stop them. Give them anything they need." The king's helper obeyed King Darius's order. God's people kept building, and soon the temple was finished. What a happy time! The people celebrated the Passover and thanked God. God's people rebuilt the temple so they would have a place to worship God. Years later, God sent His Son, Jesus, to be with His people on earth. Jesus gave us something better than the temple. He gave us Himself. Jesus is with us wherever we go.